Charlie, it's yours.
It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Georgia Squyres. Georgia, please tell us about your living histories.
First of all, thank you so much to Sri and the team for having me. I'm really pleased to be here in such an amazing session. You've also caught me at an interesting time. I'm actually still a postdoc with Diane Newman at Caltech, and so I'm just on the precipice of my career, and my history is hopefully really just beginning. But it's also a very good time to take a moment to think about how I got here, because at this stage, sort of late postdoc, people start to ask you some really tough questions, like, what do you want to do for the whole rest of your life? You know, what is the research question that's going to animate you for 10, 20, 30 years? And these are questions that fundamentally require that I know something about myself and where I want to go and how I've gotten to be where I am. And what I want to focus on today specifically is the why question. Why at each stage of my career so far, I've been doing what I've been doing. I think for natural scientists, the why question tends to be very difficult compared to some of its counterparts that are more concrete, like how do I do what I do, or what do I do, or where do I do it, which are more grounded. This is a question that doesn't feel like it has a single defined answer. I think this is what psychologists tend to call making meaning. But still, I hope to take you through sort of my trajectory of thinking about this question, and I'll be interested to hear in discussion from you if you have similar thoughts about why you do what you do. So I really think my earliest driver to do what I do is the pursuit of beauty. I always had, I think, a pretty strong aesthetic sense, and I come by this, honestly, it's genetic. My whole nuclear family are artistic. And so I was very surrounded by the arts growing up. And this, sure enough, first showed up in the form of music. I played a lot of different instruments growing up and really immersed myself in this musical world. The feature of music is that the beauty in music is underpinned by theory. You know, there are rules that specify oftentimes how music is constructed. Even music that's very complicated and modern has a foundation of theory. And so you can understand why music is beautiful by understanding the rules that construct it. And so not surprisingly, sort of immediately after an interest in music came an interest in mathematics for a very similar reason, that there was so much emergent beauty in math underpinned by fundamental rules that I could understand. And so a lot of my early childhood academic interests and sort of into school were stuff like number theory and other places where you could really, from first principles, build up this beautiful aesthetic world. And initially, I was really picturing myself sitting in an office being a mathematician. By the time I got to college, I was thinking, okay, maybe something like math or physics. But ultimately, this led me down sort of a dark alley, which is that I found biology the most beautiful natural science of all. A lot of physicists, I think, have their own stories about what drew them in to biology. In the end, for me, there were two parts. The first was seeing the beauty of genetics. Classical genetic experiments where very complicated details of how genetic information is transferred were worked out through very simple mathematical experiments. And then also just the aesthetic beauty of a molecular motor. And ultimately I ended up here in the lab of Dr. Lars Dietrich at Columbia, studying pattern formation in these. These are biofilms, bacterial communities. This is Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and it makes these beautiful, wrinkly, complicated structures when you grow them together. Unfortunately for me, though, this turns out to be hideously complicated. These biofilms are made up of thousands to millions to quadrillions of individual bacterial cells. And then if you look inside an individual bacterial cell, the picture gets even worse. And so this sort of aesthetic purity was replaced by what has been referred to by Horace Freeland Judson as the rage to know, which characterizes in scientists this drive to understand something complicated that feels frustrating or infuriating in a way that's very animating. And so what this meant for me is that I really wanted to develop tools and a framework to understand what was going on in a complicated system like this. I was also completing a degree in biophysics, and it seemed really clear to me, as we've heard from other speakers today as well, that using tools from physics was a good way to understand complicated problems in a simple way. So I went to graduate school mostly to learn to do stuff like this. So this is a lot of light microscopy and quantitative imaging that still underpins my work. But I also wanted to become a scientist. And I wanted to sort of slot myself into this big human endeavor of science that's really good at finding answers to these complex and frustrating and rage-inducing problems. When I think about the process of becoming a scientist, I love to think about this book. This is the Silent Book, which is advice to alchemists from 1677. And the translated portion here below is pray, read, reread, work, and you will find. I find it very comforting to know that even chemists in 1677 felt they weren't reading enough. But luckily for me, I also did my work in an environment where there were more proximal role models. And truly, my PhD was about getting as close as possible to as many scientists as possible and trying to learn from each one of them about what it meant to become a scientist and to become capable of answering these complicated questions and ultimately getting back to this beauty in the natural world. And this is just a small snapshot of the people that had a really big impact on me in this time. And I also, especially near the end of my PhD, got the chance to look forward and train some really, really wonderful students. And so I also began to think about what it meant to be part of a chain into the future as well of scientific endeavor. At the end of your PhD, there's a funny transition where the people that have been telling you what to do, to schedule your committee meetings, et cetera, suddenly start asking you what you're going to do. And I felt like, okay, I've come here, I've sort of tried to start becoming a scientist, I've developed these tools and this way of thinking, and I've learned from all these people. And I wanted to return to the challenge of addressing a really hard problem. I felt drawn to sort of rise to the occasion and come up with a really difficult problem. And I went back to my favorite, most difficult problem, which is bacterial biofilms. Now I approach things pretty differently. So this is some data now from my postdoc, and this is what I spend my days staring at now. We're using a microscope to look at the behavior of individual bacterial cells inside a complicated community. And I cannot say that I have an enormously greater amount of insight now than I did as an undergraduate, but at least I feel like I have the potential to have some leverage on this problem. And what I love about a system like this is that we can start to address questions that are really fundamental. How does development work? How do cells work together in groups to organize themselves in space and time? And this felt like a challenge that I was really excited to take on. And the animating force in my postdoc has been trying to position myself to really start thinking about some very hard problems. And the last thing I want to say is just that I've presented this as a timeline in blocks, but in reality, all of these things still animate me now. I continue to be a musician, so this is an octet that I sing with at Caltech. I try to be as serious a classical musician as I can. Our first album is coming out at the end of this year. I retain the rage to know, and it's still about the same question. I am not convinced that I understand biofilms all that much better than I did then, but the rage animates me still, so maybe we'll get there. I have been so fortunate to continue to train in an environment where I can learn from all of the scientists around me. I'm in Diane Newman's lab here, and there's no better place to be a postdoc. And moving on to my own research lab, I've been thinking about harder and harder problems. So I have sort of become a microbiologist, and this is one of the problems that animates us in the field. This is projections of antimicrobial resistance deaths into 2050. The y-axis is deaths in millions. And so we are challenged to think about really, really hard problems and the ways that we can contribute. And my hope in the future is that I can position myself in a way to be accountable to all of these interests. That's all I wanted to say. I hope to hear from you about what you think. Thank you so much. Happy to take your questions.
Great. Thank you for a fantastic talk, Georgia, and I'm applauding on behalf of the audience. The first question is, we talked about this pursuit of beauty and beauty as arising from like an underlying elegant logic in systems like music and math. And now when you're working in hard or complicated problems, how do you think about finding beauty?
It's a great question. This is where I hope to be in the study of my system, biofilms. So in music or math, I think it's a little bit tractable to imagine that there are a couple of components at play that each follow a couple of rules that are simple. And if you understand those rules completely, you can define the behavior of the system. I think you can do the same thing in more complicated systems. It's just harder. So the hope of what I would like to do is to really understand how individual cells in the biofilm organize their behavior, what rules they follow, and how this leads to order at the biofilm scale. I think answering this for every process and every biofilm on Earth is a project scoped slightly larger than one person, but I do believe that using this as a guiding framework gets you to ask some pretty good questions and gives you tractability on a question that otherwise is almost irreducibly complicated. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, great, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and another question around music, and you're continuing to pursue music. How does that impact the science that you do on a day-to-day level and how you approach science?
A great question. Like I said, I try as hard as I can to be as serious a musician as I can, and I actually think I'm still getting better all the time, which is very gratifying. Um, I think there are two things that are important. The first one is the type of music that I do. I sing in an 8-person choir. It's a truly team effort that requires a huge amount of mutual trust and teamwork. And so, just like science is a team built on trust, I think I reinforce that by going to rehearsal where I'm really accountable to my choir mates to be sort of working toward a shared mission, but with my own unique contribution to make. Something else that I really like is that I'm not a very good singer. It was never my instrument growing up. I was more of a piano player and I got into percussion for a while. I was never great. And there's something very liberating about doing something that I'm not very good at and just trying to get better. And the nice thing about music is if you practice hard, you do get better in sort of a linear way. So I also think just the practice of trying to do something that's hard for me, that is not my sort of innate skill, and seeing that nonetheless I can get better with effort has been very complementary to what I try to do in my research.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer. And one more question from the chat. So when do you plan to slack off?
Well, um, funny, I try to make time, like I said, to sing. That's another thing that's nice about having a rehearsal time. I'm accountable to be there to my choir mates no matter what, so I better do that. But I live now in Southern California. I'm at Caltech. I'm originally from New Jersey, so pretty far from home, but it's a beautiful place to be. We're very close to the mountains, so I try to get out to hike. And I have a cat who gets very grumpy if I don't come home at my specified time in the evening. So I ultimately am accountable to him to make sure that I have my evening time well in order.
Great. Thank you. And thank you again. I'm applauding one more time and I'm passing it back to Sri.